Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Third Age Babylon 5 podcast, where we are going to take a look at the brand new Babylon 5 The Road Home movie. It just came out, we just watched it for the first and for the second time, and yes, we are going to talk about it. As usual, we are Layla and Alexander. Meike isn't with us today because she's our first time watcher of the series as a whole, so she doesn't get to see this movie for more than a year still. That's fun for her. We will probably have a discussion with her about this movie at the very end of our entire Babylon 5 run, so this is going to be a nice frame for everything that we do on this podcast. To discuss this movie, of course, we're going to have a slightly different structure than to the usual episode discussions. We're going to start with first impressions and also a little bit of a technical review. We're going to talk about the visuals, the audio, maybe also the direction, everything that we can talk about spoiler-free. And then we are going to dive into the story, and we're going to do this in two different steps. We are first going to look at the small picture, The Road Home as another addition to the Babylon 5 we know and love. And then we're also going to talk about the big picture, Babylon 5, The Road Home, as a sort of revival of the franchise and where it might lead to next. So, without further ado, let's maybe start with our first impressions and your very fresh, very first reaction.
That is my very fresh reaction, actually. I have to say that there are 2 points about this movie that were difficult for me. First of all, I'm not really into animated movies and shows. It doesn't mean that I don't like any of these and that I don't appreciate the art that is put into it, but I have a problem of connecting with those stories and of really sinking into them, and I'm not sure why, but that is just true for me. And the other part is that I'm in general in sci-fi very, very skeptical when we have a story where we jump timelines or universes, like when we don't really add something new to the world building or to the plot, and we just play around with quantum physics is where I'm usually a bit out of it, actually. Yeah.
Okay, then just to assuage anybody who is very worried at this moment, I absolutely loved it, although I do share some of the caveats that you just mentioned. A key difference here is that I watched the trailer, I prepared myself mentally for this movie, and even though I'm not a big fan of time travel stories or multiverse stories, I knew that going into it, and so I could kind of prepare myself and work on the acceptance of that. And I'm also in general a bigger fan of animated movies, so this worked out quite well for me. But yeah, let's talk. We have talked a little bit about the very first impression. Let's talk a little bit about the visuals, because you had a few things to say about those, right?
About the visuals. Yeah, I mean, when in the beginning of the movie, we arrive at this power station that Sheridan has to... Wait, that's not a spoiler if I say that, right?
No, that's the very beginning.
We arrive at this power station that Sheridan has to
Open up,
right? I thought about how it felt to watch Clone Wars, the animated series, for the very first time, which is animated and I like it very much. So that's really these kind of vibes it gave me, and I found that very positive and very cool.
I think the very first movie of Clone Wars also takes place on a very crystalline planet, so this might even increase the nostalgia a little bit. And I feel much the same way. The entire animation style, especially with the characters, gave me almost a mix of the 2 different Clone Wars series that were produced. And I think it worked quite well. I even more liked to see most of the space stuff that we saw. The new version of the White Star I really, really enjoyed. I think Babylon 5 has never looked better, which isn't to say that everything was perfect. I think in terms of the dynamic movements in the space fights, especially when we see Babylon 5 Under Siege, I would still stick to the original series with that. I'm going to be a purist about this. But no, I think this is a really good start, and fingers crossed if we get more of this animated Babylon 5 era. In the Clone Wars, we've seen how much this style can also grow as a team gets more experience, builds more assets. There is incredible stuff that can be done, and much to its credit, The Road Home already does a few things in terms of the scale that can be depicted that we just never got to see in the original show in live action. It's reminded me most of some of the depictions that we saw in the Babylon 5 comics back in the day, which already increased the scale of everything a little bit. So this was just very fun to see. That's one big aspect of the movie. The other side, of course, is the audio. So the music and the voices both of which are a little bit extraordinary for this movie because we have a new composer and we have a lot of new voices that sadly had to step in because so many of the original cast are no longer with us. So how do you think this worked out? Because that's like very core part of the movie, right?
Yeah, there are also, first I have to say a general thing, because I also have a problem with these dubbing in movies. Like in general, I don't like the German German dubs in movies a lot.
Yeah.
So I watch the original whenever I can, and if it's a language I don't know, I just work with the subtitles as good as possible. So in general, that always makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But I think they did a really good job here. Like especially Jakar's voice was like, how do you find such a voice? I mean, I know there are agencies that can give you a voice that fits, but this is so specific. I was really like playing with the original actor. Just someone, do you know someone like that? I found that really is like yeah, such a coincidence to find such a fitting voice. That was very good, I thought. As well as the melody of Dylan, because with Dylan there were two layers that speaker had to copy because the actress didn't have English as her first language, and also, of course, had an own kind of melody for this spiritual alien that she portrayed, and that was also very fitting. I think that was a lot of training there to accomplish that.
Yes, and I would add to that also some of the returning cast, like Bruce Boxleitner reprising his role as Sheridan, did really, really well, sort of glossing over the fact that a few decades have passed in the meantime. I think he pulled off a young Sheridan very well. In terms of German dubs, I'm entirely with you, and I think we should at some point do a special episode on the German dub of Babylon 5, because apart from the voice quality, there are so many strange translation choices, right down to the fact that in Germany, we don't have the show Babylon 5, we have Space Center Babylon 5. So added English words for no further reason. And once you get into episodes titles, it becomes an absolute nightmare.
I've never seen it in German, so I really don't know. I think the voices will shock me.
You are in for a treat. So I think if this is already something that you have to deal with in general, then of course experiences is in animated form is something else entirely. There's also a Spanish dub of the Road Home. Maybe you should watch that at some point. That's going to be interesting. Yeah. The other part of the audio is, of course, the music. And I think we both agree that it was very nice to hear some of the themes recurring, like the opening theme of Babylon 5 and such, had some very nice appearances in there. But for me, at least, it maybe felt a little bit too modernized. I was missing a little bit of the late 80s, early 90s funk that some of the original Christopher Franke put in there.
Yeah, maybe also not just funk, but just this atmospheric level really was missing that I think the show really had as a trademark in the second half, totally. Yes. Maybe also, to be fair, in such a short movie, maybe you also just don't get the space to explore that as the composer, probably. But yeah, that was definitely less atmospheric.
I think what would have been very interesting to see, and what this movie really doesn't lend itself so well, is developing a few new original themes for this movie. This movie is so much of a return to places and characters and such that we've already seen that it kind of had no other choice than to return to a lot of the musical themes also that we knew. Which isn't to say it was bad in quality. I think it's perfectly well done. It's just not the little bit extra that maybe we were hoping for. But no, in general, the whole experience of watching this movie was very well done for me. There was nothing that immediately took me out of the experience in the voices, in the visuals. So at the end of the day, I think with all minor gripes aside, I think it's a perfectly good watching experience. And yeah, maybe the last thing to add in our very first segment here is, in general, with my first impressions and all the technical sides together, I think anybody who is a fan of Babylon 5 should watch this film and should support it, both for what this movie already is, but also what the potential it opens, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. On the other side, I don't think this is the film that is going to pull in huge new audiences if somebody hasn't seen anything of Babylon 5 and now go watch this to see the thing. Maybe it will be a good animator to then go back and watch the entire show so that the movie makes more sense. But I think this is a film that is primarily made for the fans that are already out there, as a way to showcase that this is actually a strong fan base. And this is something that JMS is very good at. He already managed to get like a huge mobilization for people on social media garden when the issue was the reboot. So I think for this, the movie is very well achieving what it set out to do.
Yes, I have to think of a headline that I read about it. I didn't read the article because I didn't want spoilers yet, but I read that the movie was more about the creator than about the thing itself. And I have to say that I don't agree, but I agree that it was definitely written out of nostalgia. But it's a kind of nostalgia that you share if you enjoyed the show. I mean, there's nothing worse than the moment when you have finished a series of books, a TV show, a series of movies, and you have to move on because there's nothing left. Or you have to start over. But if you start over for the third time, maybe you are afraid that you get bored, you know.
Yes.
There's nothing worse than that. So I think this movie is really like, you can watch that because you want to pick up a little more of the character dynamics, a little more of the feeling of the world. I think for that nostalgia it was written, and that is something that fans share with the creator, definitely.
I 100% agree, and maybe you can help me. We might have to cut a little moment of this out, but somewhere around here should be a copy of Becoming Superman. So just to comment on this headline, I do think this movie is about the creator, but so is the entirety of Babylon 5. Other podcasts have done a very good job plugging this book by JMS, Becoming Superman, where he talks about creating Babylon 5, about his whole life story. And there is so much there that he puts into this. There's so many instances where characters just speak through him. The reason why we have to deal with Jeffrey Sinclair and John Sheridan is because they all share initials with the creator of the show. So this isn't anything new. And I think if it is the creator speaking, the great maker speaking to us through this animated movie, then I can't help but fully agree with him, because ultimately what this movie comes down to is a message about love for the universe, love for each other, and for this entire journey that Babylon 5 represented. So,
and I mean, if you as a writer are at the point that you accept yourself as the great maker of the universe that you created, this is a writer who deals with it a lot more clever than others. I mean, I don't want to call names here and get into other discussions, but I think you know who I mean.
Yes.
And I just remembered that I have to read this as an inspiration for maybe also pulling off something as a writer one day.
It is absolutely worth the read, so definitely go ahead with it, or get the Audible version of it, because then you get the entire book read by Londo, which I know you're not usually into audiobooks, but this is a pretty strong selling point, I would say.
That actually is, yeah.
I don't know if he did the accent the entire way through, though, so I can't give you promises.
Why wouldn't he?
It was so good to hear Londo again in this film. And yeah, I think with this, let's go into the small picture discussion. And this potentially is a very, very small part of our entire discussion of this movie, because this is now considering The Road Home as another story in the Babylon 5 universe that we know and love. Similarly, along the lines of the TV movies that were produced when the show was still airing, so Third Space, River of Souls, In the Beginning, these additional adventures that we get to see. And in terms of that, The Road Home is a very, very small story where President Sheridan gets to open a mall. The mall happens to have tachyons in it, so he is once again lost in time, gets retrieved by Dylan, and everything is fine again. And we know how the story goes from there, because we've already had 2 series finales in the show and movies to send us off. Which isn't to say that this is in any way, shape, or form a bad thing. I think the movie is just also itself very aware of the fact that this isn't a big continuation of Babylon 5. This isn't a big spin-off that already was attempted. This is a much more intimate look at the show and its experience, which, if anything, grants us a little bit more character insight. Here and there may be some implications of world building or confirmations of world building that we already knew about, but this isn't moving the story massively forward, which in my opinion makes sense because the story was already finished.
Yeah. I mean, in general, I already read a lot of statements when there is a reboot in discussion or a prequel or whatever, that you kind of don't have to write it or don't have to make it if the story is already told. But I also think that if you use that too much, then at some point you don't have anything to write about anymore. I mean, when you read, at least when I, for example, read long historical novels, which I love so much, They are long because I get a lot of information that don't put the plot forward specifically, that are just there to dive into the world and to bond with the world. So I think, yeah, that was done here, definitely. It was played around with the idea of this world from an outside view.
Yes, in sometimes even very literally. And I think it's very important not to drift into a very reductive perspective like you described there, because at the end of the day, well, the hero's journey has played out once before, so why do we tell stories at all anymore? Like, obviously there has to be more than that, than just trying to tell new things. So maybe let's talk, and might be talking very briefly, about some of the new things that we learn that might put things into a slightly different light on our very own Babylon 5 rewatch that we're doing as the main part of our podcast. And for me, one thing that I always knew was there, but I was very happy to see, is Sheridan's farm and David Sheridan back at home, because I don't know, it is something about science fiction. It's Picard on his vineyard. It's the old American Midwest back home that is just so wonderful to see. And no, it was really a very nice look. In general, I was very happy to see so much of Earth in this iteration.
I loved it that we have flying cars.
Yes, exactly, and that they still require parallel parking for some reason. That was a fun tidbit to have. And in terms of the more interesting stuff, I thought the whole glimpse of a timeline where Babylon 5 loses the Shadow War did for me actually enhance the Shadow experience a little bit. And this might just be because out of all story arcs that we see in the original series of Babylon 5, this was perhaps the most rushed one. And just these little tidbits of how the Shadows actually fight, how the Siege of Babylon 5 plays out, and how the Warlords are very sore losers in a war that they are not outright winning. All of these things I thought were nice to see, and also very strongly anchored in little elements that we already knew from the show.
Yes, that was definitely interesting to see. What I think about what made writing them good, or they are written good because we don't see a specific reason of what went wrong in another timeline. So it's not that we see at this point everything went totally wrong because Sinclair is such a different commander than Sheridan.
Yeah.
I think like fooling your own characters like that is always a bit unnecessary, I think. That's something that I really, really liked about it.
In general, we get this sense that on the one hand, the whole time travel and multiverse aspect is still very much contained, because it is all still about the time travel story that is already in Babylon 5, in Babylon Squared and the War Without End. But on the other hand, it also doesn't try to nail everything down with even more specifics that run the risk of creating more contradictions. And in general, I didn't feel like this movie was trying to fill in the gaps, which I'm very happy about. This might be a little bit of an obscure reference, but the closest thing similar to this movie that I can imagine was watching The Plan in Battlestar Galactica, which is sort of infamously, it's the one where the plan of the Cylons gets spelled out. It's kind of an infamous story how in the intro of every Battlestar Galactica episode you get told the Cylons have a plan, and famously the writers of the show didn't have a plan. And then the show ends and the writers are like, okay, we have to make one more movie. Let's do a movie from the Cylons' perspective and spell out their plan.
So it's I have watched that. It's like this.
Yes, we watched it.
I watched
in
America. Episode in my head.
Yeah, and it ends up being kind of disjointed and unsatisfying ultimately, because it tries to take any little plot hole that exists in the series and then just fill in the gaps, kind of find little spaces where stories might take place, which isn't always a bad idea, but I'm glad that this movie didn't really do that. Instead, we have one big scene. We always knew that Babylon 5 in one timeline gets destroyed, and where the distress signal from Susan Ivanova comes from, and we get a little bit more context for that. But even then, it doesn't try to explain to us, like you said, exactly what went wrong and where everything happens and what happens to the survivors. It just expands things a little bit, but it's more about the atmosphere, the character insight, than trying to make the plot work even more. And I'm very glad about that. I think this worked out really well.
Yes, I agree. Definitely.
Another thing that we get to see that is interesting is, of course, the other side of the coin, a timeline where the Shadow War went even better than what we saw on the show, which it didn't even happen at all. and I think we see, I mean, apart from the long ending scene, which we will talk about in a little bit more detail, we also get to see a little bit about what happens to Epsilon 3 after the Shadow War is done, that there's now the entire race of the Zathri that has been replicated for presumably some purpose. I'm not entirely sure. So any thoughts on that, how that might advance things or our perspective on the show?
Yes, I don't know if I would have maybe needed to see more of that, because it is good that they in the other timelines didn't spell out what went wrong or who did a mistake or what was the different point. But I feel like my question would be, in this universe, is the thing that we don't have the cycle? Like, do we not have the shadows and the warlords anymore? Or did others of the old races survive, and do we have another kind of cycle? Or do we not have any of the old races at all anymore? And if we don't, shouldn't we have like a lot of other species around that we don't know about? Or shouldn't other species that we know have already disappeared?
How far does the butterfly effect go in this scenario? And funnily enough, people are bombarding JMS with questions about that on Twitter. People are asking, what is Minbari culture like? Because Valent technically didn't exist in this iteration, because the Triluminary never gets used in things. And the only answer that we've gotten so far is there are notes, there is a Bible somewhere out there where JMS has figured out some of that stuff. Because if more animated movies get made, this is going to be the starting point.
So we get more animated movies in that alternative universe.
But
that's interesting.
It is very interesting. And I think this is something where we can veer into big picture stuff now. Babylon 5, I firmly believe, has the potential for a million amazing shows. I think you could make a great show about the entire ascendance of Earth into the galactic community. You could have a great series about the Telepath War, about the mission of the Excalibur that we saw in Crusade, about all the future scenarios from the Season 4 finale. But all of this was tried, and all of it failed. I am glad that this movie is not yet another attempt to do that, and is kind of saying, okay, guys, we are having the same style as the original 90s show, we have the same characters, some of the same actors and stuff involved in there. But even if we do this, even if this animated era is successful and does more, we are going to stick with that a little bit. And do at least a very soft reboot of looking at the different scenario of this. And for me, this is sort of the ideal scenario, because the entire point of this final scene to me was, let's return to Season 1 and have the bickering Jakar and bickering Londo, and everything is alleviated, and without the horrible weight of everything that happened in the Shadow War. And it felt like home. Even though I know technically it's a different timeline and blah, 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 I don't care. It feels like home, and I'm completely open to dive into those experiences and answer all these questions, because I already have like this whole slew of things that I want to know about what's played out differently.
Yeah. I have to say to that usually about those kind of stories, I'm also very, very skeptical. Like, I have to think of the Star Trek trilogy a few years ago, which felt weird to just create an alternative universe to do what exactly?
Destroy Vulcan.
Yeah, I mean, actually, okay, the most awkward thing is that I watched the second movie without realizing that it was another universe, and was like, but that's a different thing.
Confusing.
That's a different thing. But in this universe, I think it makes sense, because Babylon 5 has a very strong premise and a very strong view on how civilization works and what shapes civilization in all kinds of layers. So to see this alternative, it actually makes sense to look at it.
It also feels to me like a very deliberate way of going about it. Like, we see very, very little about this timeline, but immediately you, for example, get the hint that Sheridan and Dylan have chemistry. Very good chemistry. And even though he has no idea that he just witnessed the culmination of his ultimate love story right in front of his eyes, and it saved the universe. There is kind of this hinting there, and I very much enjoy that. And I think this is where Babylon 5 can also benefit a lot from the fact that the original is a much more contained show, that the sprawling effects and how much things can get out of hand is very much more contained. So it's very easy to keep a hold on that. And this for me harkens back to what we said in the very beginning. If this sets up new stories and we never see anything with time travel and multiverses again, I'm very happy about that. I don't need any more setup for this. But it will still benefit from being this sort of parallel thing, because we have enough information to infer a whole lot about this universe. It doesn't need to start from scratch, but at the same time, it has now a lot of freedom for exploring things. Maybe the invaders that sent the one knowledge probe that we saw in one episode as a B-plot is now going to be the big bad of the entire galaxy. I don't know what I would be up there for seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I found it funny to play around with that scenario in no, was it the same? Yes, it was the same. Because I think in that universe without the Shadow War and everything was where this private company for the space exploration, what are they called?
IPX, Interplanetary Expeditions.
They just went broke or installment or whatever and didn't exist. And I mean, it's not, we don't know if the shadows are out there and they just weren't woken up or anything, but it's funny that you can think about it. So this private thing, this SpaceX equivalent gets broken, so no one wakes up the shadows. That's a funny implication, although we don't know if that's actually the case.
It's kind of this thing where we could go wild speculating, like how much of the prophecy does Dylan know, and is in this version of a timeline her religion just wrong, or how did things go out? But this might fill a completely different podcast at another time.
But you said that Babylon 5 tried all of these other things and they eventually failed. I think that's also due to the fact that I think it was a bad time for sci-fi when they came out, where it just all stagnated a little bit. Also, Star Trek didn't continue, and it's a bit. So I also think that that's kind of. I think a show like the 5 seasons of Babylon 5 had a kind of effect on an audience when they came out historically in a short era, like after the Cold War in this 90s feeling. They had a perspective that was interesting. So I guess a universe like Babylon 5 could, in the scenario that we live in right now, actually give a lot of interesting view again in a new version.
And this is where having it start with the slightly clean slate would be a massive benefit, because then you don't carry any baggage around. What I think massively benefits Babylon 5 here as well, and is reiterated in this film a lot, is this isn't a universe that was tailor-made just for the singular story. And this is something that I love to see. For example, we don't know if the shadows are out there, because the Shadow War isn't there in this timeline, but the Great Machine is. And it kind of gives you this inspiration that Zatharas doesn't just exist to facilitate the time travel plot. And the Great Machine doesn't just exist to be this time travel plot. And I think this is very interesting, because it opens up the opportunity to imagine, okay, what are the Vorlons like in this version? Are they still around, and are they much more open people now? Or is the Shadow War maybe still a looming threat that just nobody knows about, and suddenly this universe is much scarier than the one that we knew existed at this point? It's also possible. So I think because Babylon 5 always took care to kind of give this impression of this isn't a universe that exists solely for the show, it existed before and after, this now pays off in a very big way.
What I want to say about this final, or not final scene, but Sheridan says at some point, I think it's our Sheridan who says that the Minbari think that the universe is conscious. And an interpretation about Babylon 5 in general that I've always enjoyed was that because I think the universe in itself makes a lot of sense. So I always wanted a scientific explanation on why we have telepath in general. Yes. Why is it possible that any species has telepath? And so I always thought that the ultimate version of telepath that the Vorlons probably most likely are are probably telepaths on a level that they can communicate with the universe, that would explain prophecies, that would explain looking into the future without time travel. And this conscious being, the universe as a conscious being, is wonderful also because it's not super spiritual. It's not like it makes scientifically sense on that super high level that we are 1 million years in the future. I really like that. And my idea at the moment is that if the machine is everywhere, even when we don't have a shadow war, maybe this machine is just like a universe, like the body of the universe, or the conscious of the universe, or the whole of the conscious of the universe. That would be my idea.
And at least it is like a very strong point of reflection there also through Zathras, who has the ability to communicate in between timelines. We know that, which it's a fun thing for this specific character because we don't have to take him too seriously, even if he breaks the fourth wall and talks about copyright. But it plays into this larger version. And the one thing that we get spelled out, which I was originally very skeptical about, is we get to see the rim, which was always sort of talked about. People have gone beyond the rim, and it was always sort of this metaphysical, is it the rim of the galaxy or something else? And now we know it is a concrete place. But once again, I'm very happy with it because it plays into a theme that Babylon 5 always had. Lorien talks about the space between tick and tock in time, between two different places in being. And now it makes a lot more sense if we see there is literally this universal consciousness, how high up there he was, to have the same sort of bipolar understanding of existence and the universe and everything.
But just to be clear, the rim we see here, is that like the border of the galaxy?
I don't think so.
What do you think?
I think this is a much more metaphysical space where... yes and no, it's kind of when we see at the end of the Shadow War, the first ones going beyond the rim. Yes, they are physically moving outside of the galaxy, but it also entails going beyond this realm of reality in some shape or form. And I mean, we talked in the beginning a little bit about the writer speaking through his work. I think the way is this more apparent as the writer is the core mythology for this universe, reiterating the fact that the existence of Babylon 5 rises and falls with the fact that somebody is watching. I mean, that is a wonderfully ham-fisted, but at the same time very clever way of talking about the fact that people have to watch this movie, otherwise there's not going to be any more. But I think as a mythological thing, as something to bring home what actually constitutes meaning in this mythology, it works really well because on the one hand it has this very spiritual aspect, it also has a sort of scientific aspect about it, and it leaves so much room still for any kind of religious mythology to exist within that. It gives us sort of the highest perspective on the universe without invalidating Valen or the Great Maker or any other iteration that we've seen in this show, which is very, very good. Once again, keeps the integrity of the universe intact.
Yes, and I have to think of the scene. Actually, it will come up in the next episode we're going to discuss with Meike, I think. I mix up all of these little scenes between characters. Sometimes that's a problem for us.
I'm pretty certain you're talking about the right one.
I'm talking about the scene with Jakar and I forgot her name, Catherine. Oh,
yes,
Catherine. Yeah, where he just picks up this bug and tells her that. What does he tell her exactly?
That there are beings in the universe that compared to us are compared like a human to an ant.
Yeah.
Not noticing us, and if they do, it might be dangerous.
Yes, I have to think of that. And when we talk about now that, because that is specifically a point that this movie points out so well about the universe as a conscious being, then I find this bug metaphor on so many levels interesting, because we could always think of what is our quantum bubble? What does it look like from the outside? Is there someone seeing our bubble on the outside? Because, in quantum physics, we have just talking as a physicist, you just have this problem of it never stops. You always need someone to observe the bubble or reality collapses. So a lot of doors are opened up there just in the thoughts, and I find that beautiful. And also that we come back to a scene in the show.
I mean, talk about callbacks in this movie. The fact that, you in the very first season of Babylon 5, within the first 10 episodes, you get Jakar picking up an ant and talking about the perspective on the universe. And then in the, for now, latest edition of the Babylon 5 universe, you get uh, interpretation of Jakar picking up Sheridan like said and teaching him the same lesson from a different perspective. Like there are so many instances, I can't list them all. I tried to write some of them down where this is just wonderful callbacks. And in this case, callbacks where it's very comfortable to say this isn't fan service. This isn't making a reference for the sake of making a reference, but it's integral to how the story plays out. And everything that comes in between these two scenes that we just discussed sort of leads up to that and sort of adds context to that, which is the best kind of callback that you can possibly imagine. Before we drift too far apart, there's actually one thing that came back to the forefront of my mind in terms of new things that we learn. I'm very happy actually with what we learn about the shadows, and it is something also that he was asked about. We get for the very first time a definitive answer to the fact that the shadows are in fact still physically embodied beings. They haven't ascended to some kind of energy beam, which is very much fun because they can get splattered all over the station in these intense fighting scenes. But it's also very interesting to see that, yeah, ascension isn't a one-way path. And if we talk about this highest instance of the universe that we see, it doesn't dictate a path to some sort of higher level of existence. And so these ancient ones have still the freedom to take very different plays and play out in very different ways. And that's just fun, I thought.
Well, the Wallons are energy beings.
They are completely energy jellyfish-like things.
Because they have managed this level of being telepath that communicate with the universe. Supposedly.
Supposedly so, yes.
That's just interesting.
Although at the same time they've managed to be incredibly dense about listening to the universe while doing so. So it's just very fun that
yeah, I mean, just because you have the ability doesn't mean that you always use it, right? I mean, we also have to always picture that at some point on the Wallon homeworld, there are discussions, there are different opinions. So yes. I think that just take place on such a different level of time and space. It's like, I think humans and Wallons is like for spiders, we are just a rock in the landscape because we are so big and
yes.
so slow.
Which, I mean, is a sad truth that gets confirmed when Sheridan tries to parley with the Wallons about saving Earth and just presumably got blown up in his shuttle very unceremoniously, which, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, maybe to close things off, are there some favorite scenes that you would like to talk about? Because I have a handful of them, and they all tie into the big picture stuff, which is why it's good that we kept them for the end, but maybe some highlights.
Some highlights. Oh, I have to think about it for a moment.
Should I then talk about one of mine?
Yes, pick one of yours.
All right. I already alluded to it that I like the time jump into the final things we see of Earth's fate if the Shadow War is lost. There are a few reasons why I love this. Ivanova and Londo is probably my favorite character duo possible, and them sitting on the rooftop and seeing everything that happens is just beautiful. I love the little quips that Londo does about a very lonely thought in Sheridan's head. It's very nice, but this is something that Babylon 5 repeatedly does, and that I've even talked about with some other fans very recently in discussions about the episode Severed Dreams, where the big space battle takes place. And Babylon 5 really likes to take its time with destruction and special effects. Like if in Babylon 5 a battleship gets blown up, it doesn't just explode in a special effects explosion. It gets twisted and burns, and there's little bits coming off. It is like very detailed and visceral. And that's very much how I felt also about the Earth destruction sequence that we get here. This isn't the Death Star popping a planet like a balloon. No. This is the Shadows not wasting a shot, plunging the moon into the Earth. We get to see tsunamis. We get to see like gravitational effects. We get to see the planet, the moon eclipsing the sun. All these details are put in there in a very long sequence that, once again, plot-wise, doesn't move things terribly much more. I think Sheridan got the gist of the fate of Earth very much quickly. But it adds so much weight to this event, even though it doesn't matter, quote-unquote. I think it manages in this very small sequence to just present us with a little bit more gravitas for what the destruction of a planet actually means than what we've seen before. And I also really liked it as a juxtaposition for how we've seen the end of Earth before, where before the closest thing that Earth got to this point was the Battle of the Line of the Shadow War, where humans were hopelessly... the Minbari War, you're completely right, where humans were hopelessly outmatched, and there's this huge human battle fleet that gets assembled and completely blown out of the air, but then compared to what the Warlord's arrival looks like in this movie, that was nothing. Which is, I think, an interesting thing to pull off, that you essentially have like this completely hopeless scenario where in the beginning you get very impressive shots of what that must have felt like, and to up this one more time and to give one bigger sense of scale to that, this is where I think this movie and the animation medium shines the most, because
you could not have done that otherwise.
No, and I think it's also, apart from the possibility of having this in live action, I think it's also aided by the fact that this is an animated movie that is very stylized, so it doesn't need to look realistic. I don't have a problem with the moon managing to plunge into the earth within the span of a few seconds, because it is a stylized version of events that's being retold, so that works out for me very well.
I think it also fits into the Babylon 5 universe very well, that we always see this level of destruction so clearly before us, because I think here we really accept that civilization is kind of stuck in this cycle of events, in this cycle of wars, whatever, and civilizations are shaped by that and learn and develop their own ways of how to deal with it, and some work out and some don't, and some have very negative consequences. And all of that, what we learn about this view on civilization, doesn't make sense if we don't see the explosion, if we don't see the real destruction.
It can't be an abstract thing. It needs to be something tangible. And this is where I think it makes sense to have the tsunami predating the explosion of the entire planet, because the big wave that, like in the Day After Tomorrow, mows down skyscrapers, that is something that we can relate to, because that's something that actually happens on our planet. And I think bridging that gap is massively important.
Yeah.
Have you found a favorite?
Yes, I think one scene that I now that we talked about it so much really like is all of the datas in one picture.
Yes.
So really look into this machine that for me, I think, until I see more, is the being of the universe contained, so that we can use it as like the core of our quantum bubble or whatever.
Yeah.
And seeing all of them inside there, that gave me a little goosebumps actually.
Yes, and I think viewing the machine this way is very nice, because you can almost view it as this prism that gives you an insight into the entirety of the universe, and there is only a very particular type of character that can handle this kind of thing. And if we think of Dral, if we think of Zatharas, it's characters that have a good sense of humor, because taking this seriously in any way would probably just drive you insane.
Yeah.
And I think this is maybe a topic that is worth talking about, because this is one of the critiques I've seen, that some people have written that this movie was too childish for them, because it wasn't dreary and serious the entire way through. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the way that humor is given here, because it did stand out to me that Sheridan was in like very good form in terms of having one-liners and a funny thing to say at any given point in time, which personally I really like, because from how I remember this character and how I imagine him dealing with the situation where he doesn't have like months to worry about the Shadow War. No, he's like randomly thrown on his like everyday basis into an impossible situation. He can't grasp the gravitas of any of this, even if Zatharas explains to him that the multiverse is dying. He's just going to make a joke about how annoying Zatharas is and get through the day with that, which fits what we've been talking about with Meike already when it comes to Sinclair, just getting through the day in a very human way and not this like big and pompous way.
I mean, we have a lot of this humor in the show, so it didn't really surprise me. It was sometimes a lot after each other, but also because here we jump universes, so of course you have a
new universe,
structure.
New punchline.
Yeah. What I just thought about spontaneously was, I think it's always very funny, up to confusing when you have humor with Minbari, because you see them as this spiritual Jedi hippie figure, but there is so much humor between them. Like when that was late in the show, and I'm not sure when it was, but I think it was maybe even after the Shadow War, I'm not sure. When Sheridan and Delenn try to, I think they try to have a real romantic date
Yes.
for a change, and everything is so filled up with rituals for the Minbari, and so that everyone knows what's going on, especially Lanier. And then he meets Sheridan in the lift, and Lanier does just, what does he say? Like something implying. Do you remember that scene?
It's after they spent their an important night together, where
and Lanier just makes a comment that is just so
they do not have the same level of
yeah, that's just great. I love that moment. I can't wait for it. Another thing that I thought about, and I don't get it together right, is that at some point earlier in the show, a famous comedian, a human comedian, arrives on the station and sums up in one sentence what sets human humor apart from Minbari humor. And I don't think that I grasped fully what he meant, but I find it interesting that we have a writer who can put that into words.
Yes.
And that's just so great that he really sees this culture and developed this history, and so basically their humor works more like that. And that's just great. So humor definitely here has a very own language and is seen as a language in between cultures, I think, as a cross-cultural language.
It is, and it also functions for me very well as a kind of shorthand, because none of the jokes are exact repeats, but they fall all into similar categories. We had a lot of very adorable scenes of Delenn just not understanding human words and culture very well, and we get that. Of course, when Sheridan goes to the Minbari homeworld, he has a lot of Minbari that are even less used to human idioms and such, so they are not going to get any of those and be very afraid if he talks about setting babies on fire. So that just works out well for me. And one thing that I very much liked, and in general, I'm very happy that Captain Lockley got such a big role, because
I don't like her.
Nobody liked her, at least in season 5, but you have to watch more convention appearances of the actress, because she is very passionate about the time she spent on the show.
Yeah, she's just definitely a character that is written well and acted well, but I don't like this kind of people. But we can talk about that when it comes up.
Yeah, we will talk about that in months. Personally, I was very happy that she got the same level of love that Sinclair did, and such that like all the commanders of Babylon 5 are together and have these dynamics. And yeah, just that she got the same scene. Like if you are in the captain's commander's quarters on Babylon 5, people will randomly teleport in there in the most inconvenient time, whether it's Susan Ivanova teleporting when Sheridan is on the cusp of being with an Earth official and things like that. This is just something that happens on this station. I'm very happy that it keeps happening.
It is more humanly acted out than, for example, now I have to think of this scene in Star Trek TNG where Picard is still in bed with a blanket on and answers the call, and everyone's like, "Don't you want to get rest?"
Yes. So no, I was very happy to, once again, like this is a small joke that is thrown in there, but immediately adds like a level of familiarity that I'm just very happy to see with a character that didn't get a chance to spend multiple seasons on the show. So that was just very fun to see.
Yes. So that was your next second favorite scene, right?
Yes. I'm not going to order them, but yes, I very much like it.
Yeah. Now I have to think again. Because for me it's actually kind of difficult because we jump so much around and I've only seen it once, and it has a very unique structure because of that. One of my favorites, we already talked about it, but this last scene on Earth with Lombo and Ivanova, I also really enjoyed. Drinking wine when the world comes to an end it's just great.
That has something to it.
But then, yeah. Maybe you go first with another one.
Every scene that involved Lita Alexander, I was very happy with. I mean, we are currently in our own rewatch still in the time when we have Talia as the resident telepath, but
she didn't appear again.
Nope, she got vivisected and there was nothing that could be done about that. But I like this one especially because this felt very much like a continuation of late Lita Alexander at the end of the show, where she just turns into an absolute badass that gears up for fighting the telepath war, which we never really got to see, and often suffers also from the fact that she's put in the Byron story arc in season 5, which, as far as I know, basically nobody likes and enjoys.
Really?
People hate the performances in this one, but we will get to that in time. But just seeing her dynamic with Jakar and having this awesome last stand, seeing her very annoyed with Linear trying to guess the cards and project her P5 abilities, all of that I felt like worked really, really well, and her characterization I really enjoyed. Out of all the people that we saw again, I feel like this was the one that was pushed the most from what I remember her being in the show. And that was just very nice to see her getting a little bit of action.
Yeah, I think in contrast to that, Sinclair didn't really get really characterized strongly. Like, he didn't really get a moment where he was like Sinclair as we know him.
No. I mean, this is also difficult because we see him in so many different states. We see him as like an alternate Earth Force captain. We see him as commander of an alternate Babylon 5 doing its last stand. We see him as Ranger 1. So it's difficult to pull him through because he already has so many iterations. Although I have to say that this man has just absolutely no problem accepting the fact that a time traveler just joined his last stand, and he's like, I don't exactly care. Like, it's not important what Takins did to you. I have bigger problems right now. Take a rifle and join me.
I mean, at the point when you are already losing against the shadows, you think everything's possible, I guess.
And I mean, it's interesting, like, just yesterday, 2 days ago, we talked about Sinclair's early heroism and drive for going out in a blaze of glory. This is a different timeline, and there we see, like, what the ultimate endpoint of that Sinclair also would have looked like. Somebody who just goes into the breach, and I don't know. I don't know if even if the shadows are boarding the station, he was really needed with Garibaldi on this last stand at the barricade. Maybe he should have been in CIC still, or getting out the station or something. But no, in this iteration, he dies on the front line, and honestly, that just makes sense to me, short of him jumping into a Star Fury.
But still, like, he has so many other character traits for which you don't really see anything here. So also that's strongly characterized. Another scene, and I don't know if I like it, but that made me wonder, was when we had these little, like, news TV
in the very beginning.
In the very beginning, and we had this scene where Sheridan tells the first ones to go home.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, was that film in any way? Was there like were the news there when it happened?
I mean, if I had to explain it away, I would say this is on board of the White Star, so obviously they have bridge cameras and they got their footage on there somehow. But I mean,
I found that funny.
It's in general, it's like not the most elegant screening device. Also, that like the broadcast of historical events includes like images of the Icarus landing. I'm not sure how that was done, but I mean, all of these are for me also in the category where I buy into the way that this movie is stylized, and then that's fine. I mean, we could also go into a discussion of like the scientific accuracy of anything that is said about quantum stuff in this film, where I'm pretty sure that is a different kind of quantum mechanics than what we have in the real world, but I don't mind it because it's within the context of the universe clearly enough defined that I feel like there is no reason to start picking holes, because it didn't take me out of it at all.
Yeah. So, do you have another point to talk about?
No, I think we went over favorite scenes. I mean, what we can talk about, and things are going to get less and less substantial here, but having seen the setup also for what the reboot most likely looks like, I should say on that, all we've said about what the reboot is going to be like in this animated era is based on tweets by JMS, so a very reliable source, but might be misinterpreted or something like that. But if we assume that the last scene of The Road Home is where potential new animated movies would start out with, we already said in general that sounds like a good idea, but do you have any concrete things what you would say, the next movie I want to be about this?
Yes. I would definitely like to know what kind of worlds are there, what kind of alliances are there, what kind of species are there, and which are not there. So I would really like to see them more and more explore, and really like to find more older civilizations, what happened to them, to know what of the world that we know is there, or what other incidents and circles and rules are there to shape civilization. So that's really what I would like to know more about.
I can see that, and it would be interesting because this sounds like it would also involve a lot more politics, which is something that this movie didn't have at all, which for Babylon 5 is special. So having, like, I would love to see just what does the Babylon 5 Council look like in this universe? Are the 5 big powers the same? Does the League of Non-Aligned Worlds look the same? Were the Dilgar a threat that existed and such? Yeah.
And what is like the drive for civilization? What does drive them to develop spaceships and great weapons and good medicine if you don't have this threat of every... what is the normal cycle until there's a shadow war? It's more than 1,000 years.
It's tens of thousands of years. I don't want to say 40,000 because that's Mass Effect, but it's something along those lines.
So really to see if that does not happen, what is the drive of civilizations and what is the point where they fail and disappear? That's what I would like to know.
I would love to see a very Earth-centric story in this universe, because I want to see if Mr. Morden doesn't go to Clark and strikes a deal between the Shadows and the Clark regime, what struggle gets Earth to boil over in this timeline? Because I do not believe for a second that Earth Force is just going to be fine in that universe.
Yeah.
The conflict with the telepath still exists. Clark is still there and has still all the tools that he needs to get to power.
Why do we have telepaths in that universe? It means we have to have the Warlords. Otherwise, at that stage where we are as humans, we would not have telepaths.
I mean, honestly, I assume that this is a universe where the Shadows and the Warlords exist, but the cycle is in a different state. Okay. And this might just mean that the Warlords, that might just mean that the Shadows haven't been woken up yet. So if the next expedition goes to Zardum, everything plays out as we know it. Or it could mean that already 1,000 years ago something went differently. And if 1,000 years ago, for example, the Warlord victory was more absolute, then it might just be a case that technically the Shadows are there and all the mechanics for civilization are there, but they aren't going to be ready for another one in 30,000 years or so.
Or it could also mean, I mean, we definitely know that we have Warlords because we have this telepath thing. But maybe we have another one of the old ones. Maybe we explore another way of shaping civilization, because at this point, especially through the Shadows, we have this offset for social Darwinist fascism in societies. What if we have another mechanism that explore that one?
It would be super interesting because there were books written about some of the other ancient ones that exist in the universe, like maybe if the walkers of Sigma are the ones that have stayed behind and guided the younger races, they have a completely different ideology that would be fun to explore. So there is definitely potential there. But no, in general, I would love to see a story where we learn more about Earth, and I would be completely fine if this is more of an exploration of the problems that Earth has without the Shadow involvement. So maybe more of a conflict around the telepaths would be interesting to see. And it would be a good opportunity for Lita to shine even more, which I would absolutely adore.
Yes, it definitely doesn't have to be like an end of time, turning point of time show, but...
And I would love to see if at some point we get to see like a very lowly government worker that is just named Clark, and we see that in this time he just never becomes any political figure at all. That would be a fun little tidbit.
Yeah, definitely. But I would also still definitely like to explore what shapes us as worlds.
Yes.
In this one, definitely. Because if we don't have this one pusher of racism as the Shadows, basically, I mean, the Warlords also on another level, but what shapes us then? That would...
Digging into the cosmic implications of everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, in this case... this isn't an exhaustive analysis of this movie, which is good for us because it means technically we could do more of these if people are really interested in watching them. But for now, I think what we should think about is what are we most interested in, because even though this isn't a regular episode, we can still direct a question at the audience, maybe a good chunk of new audience if the movie is doing well. So maybe a question, for example, that we could ask is, what of the scenes for you was something that you would like to discuss in the context of the show? We talked about Jakar as this representation of the universe, his speech about the end. So when we get to this point in the show, we will definitely talk about that, and we will find ways of talking about that without spoiling anything for Meike. This will be an interesting acrobatic act. But there are so many other opportunities in this movie that we would love to know. What about this movie was your favorite callback to the show? Where do you think there is a lot of potential for further discussion? Any question that would come to your mind?
I thought we were asking the audience.
Yes.
So I have to ask a question.
Exactly.
Exactly. So yeah, I would like to know, if that's okay, what other people think about my theory about the universe as a conscious being, as telepathy, as a way to communicate with the universe, as an organism, as a thing. Is that something that came to your mind when you watched the show for the first time, or not at all? Or how plausible does it sound? That would interest me.
Yes, it would be very interesting. And I mean, if we are already speculating, what other alien species, other alien religions have a similar kind of insight into this? Because in this movie we get to learn that some of what the Minbari believe hits the nail on the head quite well, but then you could also dig into so many human religions that have aspects that could be applied on that, so I would love to see more of that. I want to see the Parliament of Dreams, but with this in mind.
Yeah. Also, we had good timing there.
Yeah, in general, things worked out very well for us, launching a podcast right into this wave and then seeing where it goes. All right, then. We thank you very much. As usual, you can find us on all the socials. Mastodon is in the works. Twitter/X, we have a presence there. Instagram, on Facebook, we have our discussion group and just a regular page for updates and discussions, polls, everything that you can want. And our podcast is available here on YouTube, of course, where we invite ringing the bell, pushing the subscribe button, commenting, and also on most places where you would likely get your podcasts. So Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Castbox, all this kind of stuff. Spotify, of course, also. All right.
Good.
We have nobody here to make the hard today.
I practiced.
You can practice. that was a shadow crab. Okay, that was nice.